sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Justice is coming. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For my father the king. Certainly. Of course. You are past redemption. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Justice shall be done. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. For my father the king. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. You are past redemption. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For Lord Oran. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Foul aim. For honor. A sound plan. Betrayer of the light. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Justice. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. You are past redemption. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For Lord Oran. here to help.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Of course. Certainly. For my father, the king. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor.
Feel my wrath.
Of course.
Foul knave. Betrayer of the light. Foul knave.
For Lord Oran. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor.
Our
Certainly.
brethren's town is under attack.
A sound plan.
Betrayer of the light.
Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. The light is my strength. For honor.
Our brethren's
I
town
stand
is
for
under
the
attack.
light.
Our
Certainly.
forces are under
A
attack.
sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For my father, the king.
Killing spree.
Our brethren's town
Feel
is
my
under
wrath.
attack.
For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For my father, the king. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan.
Feel my wrath.
Certainly.
Foul knave.
For honor. Certainly.
Our
A
brethren's
sound
town
plan.
is under attack.
For honor. For my father, the king. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For Lord Oran. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan.
Dominating.
A sound plan. For honor. Of course.
No, not like that. Let me do it.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
I'm here to help. A sound plan.
More gold is required.
Is there danger? For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Foul name. For honor.
Our brethren's town is
For
under
my father,
attack.
the king. Of course.
You are past redemption. Betrayer of light.
Certainly.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Of course. For my father, the king. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan.
Our
Of course.
brethren's town is under attack.
A sound plan.
Justice has come.
For my father, the king.
Feel my presence.
For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course.
You are past redemption.
Certainly. For honor. For my father, the king.
Our brethren's prayer is under attack.
Mega kill.
A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course.
Our
Certainly.
brethren's town is under
For
attack.
honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. I stand for the light. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course.
Killing spree.
For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For Lord Aron. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor.
Unstoppable.
Is there danger?
Killing spree.
For honor. For my father, the king. I stand.
Wicked
For
sick.
honor. Certainly. For honor. For Lord Aron. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly.
Our brethren's town
A
is
sound
under
plan.
attack.
Of course. Certainly. For
attack.
Lord Oran. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For Lord Oran.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
You are past redemption. For Lord Oran. For my father, the king. For Lord Oran. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Certainly. For honor.
Killing spree.
Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For my father, the king. For honor. Of course. Feel my wrath. A sound plan.
Town is under attack.
Prayer of the light. Of course. For my father, the king. For honor. Feel my wrath. For my father, the king. Justice has come. Feel my wrath. Of course. For honor. Justice has come.
Our
A sound
brethren's
plan.
town is under attack.
Of course. For honor. For my father, the king. Justice has come. Prayer of light. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly.
Double kill.
Of course. For honor.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
A sound plan.
There's no time to
What
rest.
is your wish?
I'm here to help.
Our brethren's
honor.
town is under
A
attack.
sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan.
More gold is required.
I stand for
Our
the
brethren's
light.
town is under attack.
Justice shall be done. A sound plan. For honor.
You are past redemption.
Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For my father, the king. Certainly. You are past redemption. A sound plan. Certainly.
Dominating.
stand for the light. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly.
Our
A
brethren's
sound
town is
plan.
under attack.
Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course.
Prayer of the light.
Dominator.
For honor.
Our
Certainly.
brethren's town.
Double kill.
Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor.
Mega kill. Unstoppable. Triple kill.
I am ready. A sound plan. Is there danger? For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan.
You are passive.
Certainly.
Our
A
brethren's
sound
town is
plan.
under attack.
Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course.
Double kill.
Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For Lord Oran. Justice come. For my father the king. Of course.
Unstoppable. Wicked sick. Monster kill.
Justice shall be done. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor.
Our brethren's town is under
Of
attack.
course. A sound plan. Of course. Foul. Of course. I'm here to
Our
help.
brethren's town is under attack.
A sound plan. course.
Killing
A sound
spree.
for honor.
You are past this.
A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly.
Our brethren's
Right.
town is under attack.
For danger. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. The light is my strength. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Foul name. Of course. Certainly.
Monster kill! Godlike! Godlike! Oh, double kill!
Our brethren's town is under attack. Our brethren's town is under attack.
I'm here to help. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor.
Feel my wrath.
Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Justice. Certainly.
Feel my wrath.
Dominating!
Our brethren's town is under attack. Behind!
Kill double kill!
Brethren's town is under attack. Our brethren's town is under attack. This town is under attack.